Hello. Good evening, everyone. Hello, I'm Carrie Coogan, and I'm Deputy Director of Community Engagement and Public Affairs for the Kansas City Public Library, and we're thrilled to have you here for this program, part of the library's Making a Great City series. Now, in its 8th year, this series reflects the library's deep commitment to civic dialogue and community conversation. By bringing leading voices to the table, the library helps all of us better understand how planning, design, and local decision-making shape the future of our city. One of the people who's made this series possible from the beginning is Dennis Strait, Principal Emeritus at Multi-Studio. Dennis has been a vital partner, helping guide Making a Great City with thoughtfulness and a strong belief in Kansas City's potential. We're grateful for his leadership and continued involvement in this series. Tonight's speaker, Chuck Marohn, founder of Strong Towns and co-author of Escaping the Housing Trap, will address one of our city's most urgent challenges, housing affordability. Drawing on years of research tailored to our region, Chuck will offer insights on why local action matters and how we can start to make change right here. Once the program is over, we will be taking questions right down here with the microphones, and we're also happy to be welcoming those of you watching our library YouTube channel, and we will be taking questions from you via the chat. We also want to thank our partners at Rainy Day Books, who are here with Chuck's book that he's talking about tonight and several other books from the past. And he will be signing those after the program. Now, please join me in welcoming Dennis Strait.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming tonight. And thanks to Carrie and the team here at the library. It's so easy to do these things because of all the professionalism they bring to these productions, and so I'm very appreciative of that. I also need to thank my firm for continuing to support this effort, but mostly to thank you all for caring about your community, because that's really what this discussion is about. Carrie mentioned we're in our 8th year now. This will be our 21st presentation tonight. And it all started a little more than 7 years ago with a self-professed recovering engineer who's helping cities around the country understand that we had built cities for thousands of years up until 1950, and then we started trying something new. And we're just now starting to learn the implications of what that new way of doing things has caused. And in our city, we've had discussions about how we've spread ourselves out over 4 times as much city, but we haven't really increased our population any, so we've effectively created this problem where there's 4 times as much city for each of us to try and afford, and frankly, we can't, which has created a number of challenges. We've had discussions with our Parks Department about all the challenges they face by being overextended. We've also had great discussions with folks coming from other parts of the country to help us see the paths they're going forward, to address issues at a city scale, at a neighborhood scale, and also to help address issues of equity that have been created over the years, over the last 100 years. The series that came in about 5 years ago that was supported by the Kauffman Foundation allowed for Joe Minicozzi and his group to help us see a new way of understanding where we're doing good in the city in terms of creating good return on our public commitments for city services. Recently, the Westport Regional Business League hired Urban 3, Joe's firm, to do an economic impact assessment for the Westport area. And in doing that, they updated the maps that Kauffman had developed back in 2018. And it just showed, again, where the vitality in our city exists. And this time, though, they added to that not just property taxes, but also sales taxes and income taxes, our earnings tax, to get an overall composite understanding about how much tax generation we're creating on a geographic basis. And then they took it to a step further because they also took then the costs that we've committed ourselves to and showed us what the outcome was. Everything in red on the map is where we've got enough revenue generated in those parts of the city to take care of the costs that we need to be concerned of for running a great city. And you can see that we're out of whack. There's just not enough areas where we're creating enough productive real estate in order to pay the way. And that's why we struggle with everything from potholes to public safety to issues of neighborhood security. So within the last few years, we've been focusing in on housing. We've had speakers come in to help us understand how We've managed to overregulate the the process of housing creation. We've ultimately created a situation where we have this affordability crisis and we have the homelessness crisis, and it's largely due to how difficult we've made it on ourselves to just build housing. And what we're doing this year is to now focus on that issue, and we're making a recommendation this year with tonight's presentation and the next three presentations that housing ought to be Kansas City's primary focus from an economic development perspective. And we're going to make that case starting tonight and for the next three speakers. If you want to look at our case statement, you can capture that QR code and find out more about how that case comes together. But Chuck's going to introduce the idea of housing as economic development tonight. On October 16th, A.J. Herman from Accelerator for America is going to help us understand why housing is a fundamental building block for the economy and the health of cities. On November 13th, landscape architect, and the executive director of the Incremental Development Alliance across the country is going to be here to share with us all the ways that communities are addressing this problem of overregulation of housing and things that other communities are doing that we could do to make housing easier to create again. And then on February 5th, Kobe Lefkowitz is going to come to town. Kobe's an urban philosopher, self-proclaimed, but I think he's earning it. And he's going to help us understand that in this next wave of city building, as we're really thinking about housing creation, we can also think about making wonderful places, wonderful neighborhoods, and just make our city more lovable and more of a value that'll help us all go forward and build the city that we want. Okay, so I mentioned that self-professed recovering engineer. Well, he's back after, he's been here a couple of times, but he was our kickoff speaker back in 2018. And he, frankly, is the inspiration for this series. So I'm very grateful that he's back with us. Chuck founded the Strong Towns organization almost 20 years ago now. And in addition to the conversations we're having here in Kansas City, they now have conversations going on like this with cities, over 300 cities, not only here in the country, but around the globe, on how they can move forward in a way that's more sustainable and allows the city to do the things that cities want to do. Since he was with us in 2018, he's produced 3 books. He's working on a 4th book. And all of this is really helping us understand that if we want to make great towns, if we want to make great cities, if we want to make a great country, it's all on our shoulders. It's all on you and me to really take the initiative to make your city better. So I'm going to let Chuck continue to make that case tonight. He's one of the 15 most influential urbanists in our lifetime, and I'm thrilled that he's back with us tonight. Please welcome Chuck Marohn.
There we go. Thank you. It's really nice to be back. I was thinking about how to say this. Dennis said I've been doing this 20 years. Not quite 20 years. Let's not make it that much yet. But I remember very early on in the Strong Towns conversation, I got mixed up with some people here in Kansas City, and Kansas City became our internal joke as a movement. We would always say this and then, but Kansas City. And it's funny how that has not only changed, but really accelerated. The conversation here, every time I come back, is just so much richer, so much more going on, so much more sophisticated. Dennis is a huge advocate. My good friend and colleague, Abby, where are you, out in the crowd? Abby Newsham back here, who hosts our Upzone podcast. There's just so many great things going on here, and thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you for being part of this conversation, and thank you for all the stuff you do. We have so many people here talking about how to make the city better. How can we roll up our sleeves and do great things? So I hope to give you a little bit more along those lines tonight. When it comes to housing, there are 2 conversations that are happening today in this country. The first conversation is about housing as shelter. How do we get people into a home? How do we get people into a home they can afford? How do we make housing broadly affordable for people across the spectrum? The second conversation is about housing as a financial product. Housing is core to our economy, not only the jobs that it creates, not only the wealth that it creates for families, but even more importantly, the idea that mortgages and mortgage-related products sit at the core of our financial system. These two conversations are going on today almost an exclusivity to themselves, right? There's a little bit of overlap from time to time, but generally if you're in one of these conversations, you're not part of the other. This is a huge problem because in one of these conversations, housing prices must fall. In order for housing to be broadly affordable, we need prices to come down and come down substantially. In the other conversation, housing prices cannot be allowed to fall. In fact, even a slowing of housing price appreciation creates economic problems that we struggle to deal with. This is the essence of the housing trap, the trap we have created for ourselves, where we have this thing that is essential to all of us, shelter, but is also now at the core, the beating heart of our economy. And those two trajectories have kind of diametrically opposed intentions. I want to explore how we got here, because we all live in this world of 30-year mortgages and Fannie Freddie, but it was not always this way. If we go back to before the Great Depression in this country, if you were going to get a mortgage, if you were going to buy a home and you were going to use a mortgage to finance part of that home, you would have gotten that from a local bank. The local bank would have required you to have a 50% down payment. So you would have got a lot of skin in the game. And understand why, right? What was the money that the local bank was lending you? It was literally our money. Like we all gave our money to the local bank and then they lent it out. They were going to require you, in respect to all your neighbors and the bank, to have a lot of skin in the game. They were going to write you a loan that would be an interest-only loan. So you would make interest-only payments for 3, 4, or 5 years, in which case you would have a balloon payment at the end. Now, the balloon payment could often be rolled over, or people would try to pay that down or save up money. But the idea was you were going to have a lot of skin in the game. This is a very conservative, not conservative in terms of politics, but conservative in terms of bank behavior. This was going to be a very conservative financial product because literally we were loaning your neighbor's money to you for a house. This system works really well, or worked really well, but ran into a lot of problems during the Great Depression. The Great Depression was a time, of course, of tremendous economic upheaval. It's difficult for us to get our minds wrapped around how difficult the Great Depression was, 25% unemployment. It is a really, really traumatic period of time. For people with homes that were mortgaged in this way, there was a kind of instant financial reckoning that took place. If you bought a home and you financed it at a 50% mortgage, what you found is that during the Great Depression, your home value went down. And so when your 3-year, 4-year, 5-year balloon payment came due, you would go to the bank, and the bank would say, we can lend you 50% of what your home is worth. The problem is now you actually owe more than what the bank will lend you. And so in order for you to consummate this loan, you were going to have to come up with the difference in cash. You're in the middle of the Great Depression. A lot of people who were making their payments and could continue to make their payments had the bank allowed them to, were pushed into foreclosure because they couldn't come up with this cash difference. A lot of people who, through no fault of their own, right, they were doing everything by the rules, they were following all the things they were supposed to do, all of a sudden found themselves getting kicked out of their house. Now the bank would repossess the home and do what with it? They would sell it in foreclosure. What happens when you sell a home into a market that's declining in value? What happens to the overall value of home prices? They drop. And when the home prices drop, what happens to the next person whose balloon payment comes due? They have an even bigger gap. Their home gets repossessed. That gets sold onto the market. It creates a bigger gap for the next one. This is what economists call a deflationary spiral. and this is where we found ourselves at the beginning of the Great Depression, is that housing prices continued to drop and drop and drop. And the more they dropped, the more people were foreclosed on. The more people were foreclosed on, the more homes were sold on the market. The more homes were sold on the market, the more prices dropped, and on and on and on. What the FDR administration did in their first 100 days is try to arrest this deflationary spiral. They created something called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. They essentially went to local banks and said, hey, stop foreclosing on people. If you're going to foreclose on someone, sell that loan to us. The federal government will buy that loan. They then went to the property owners and said, hey, how about we refinance that loan for you through the federal government at like good financing terms. Ultimately, the federal government went to local banks and said, we need you to lend more. We need you out helping to create and stabilize this housing market. So why don't you, instead of requiring 50% down, require just 40% down or 30% down? And I know that creates more risk for you as a local bank. So what we, the federal government, will do is insure that difference. If there's a loss, if something happens, we'll make you whole. But we just want to keep people in their homes. In fact, instead of writing 3-year, 4-year, 5-year balloon payment notes, why don't you make a 12-year mortgage or a 15-year mortgage or even a 20-year mortgage? And instead of paying just interest, why don't you make interest and principal payments along the way? And I know that's more risk for you as a local bank, but what we will do as a federal government is if you meet certain criteria, and I say certain criteria rather loosely, these were criteria that were established by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. We know them today as redlining maps, but basically if you are going to lend money in this neighborhood, the federal government will back that. We will ensure that. We will make sure that if you as a local bank suffer loss, we will make you whole. This set of initiatives did what was intended. It arrested the downward deflationary spiral, and it stabilized the housing market during this very dark economic time. It allowed people to stay in their homes, gave them the dignity of having shelter in a time of extreme economic hardship. I use a word in the book that I don't use lightly, but I want to use it again here to kind of set up what I think this is. I use the word moral. I feel like this was a very moral thing for us to do. There were a whole lot of people who, through no fault of their own, were losing everything. And this was able to stabilize that market and keep them in their house and give them the dignity of their place. Let's do a fun exercise. What got us out of the Great Depression? There we go. We're all taught in like junior high that the thing that got us out of the Great Depression was World War II. I want you to pause and think about that for a second. First of all, we live in a culture dominated by the thinking of economists, thinking that is actually kind of perverse. Because what kind of happy days are here again when you have a global war, right? Over 60 million people died. Lots of Americans were drafted into the military to go over and to kill and to die. The people who weren't stayed home and were conscripted or drafted into industries, working really hard hours, building things that had no utility value for anyone, ships, planes, munitions, stuff we would just blow up or throw away. We were rationing butter, we were rationing gasoline, we were rationing meat. These were not happy times. But if you were an economist, if you didn't really care about human suffering, but you just care about financial numbers, World War II was a fantastic boom, right? All of a sudden, this economy that had been falling and stagnant got a boost. And so economists have said, yay, war, no more depression. As the war was winding down, the economists around the president started to panic. This is a quote from a memo that Paul Samuelson, probably our most influential American economist of the last century, wrote to FDR in 1943. He said, were the war to end suddenly, there would be ushered in the greatest period of unemployment and industrial dislocation any economy has ever faced. In other words, if the war's over and we bring home all these troops and we shut down all these industries, there is nothing different about our economy today than 10 years ago. And we are going to slide right back into depression. Is that what happened? Of course not, right? We all know what happened. We built we began this project of building a different version of America. And if you've been here for either of my prior two talks, I generally tend to start with this because this is a turning point in not only how we develop our cities, but how we think about growth as a concept, an idea, and the way that we have kind of dedicated our country to making that happen. At the end of World War II, we turned our cities into machines of growth in order to stay out of the Great Depression. And I want to focus tonight on housing, because we could talk about interstate highway system, and we could talk about all the subsidies of infrastructure and what have you, but I want to look at housing tonight. Because what we did in housing was really subtle and kind of sneaky. What we did is we took those tools that we developed in the Great Depression to keep housing prices from going down, and we retooled them to make housing prices go up, to get more people into housing, to create more housing demand, to create a bigger housing market. 40% down payment, how about 30%? How about 20%? How about 10? How about 5? How about no down payment? How about down payment assistance? You want a 15-year mortgage? How about a 20-year mortgage? How about a 30-year mortgage? Let's spread those payments out over a longer period of time. You have interest rates at 10%? How about 8%? How about 6? How about 4? This is a continuous approach that we adopted after World War II to make it easier for more people to borrow more money and ultimately to pay more for housing. Here's the thing. I said we live in a world dominated by economists and economic thinking. This was awesome. This really, really worked. And for a generation that had gone through depression and war, this was an amazing, amazing experience. This is a chart that shows the 2.5 decades after World War II, 1945 to 1970. Here's what happened to our gross domestic product, basically the size of our economy. The size of our economy grew at unprecedented rates. At the same time, our federal debt, which was at massive, massive levels at the end of the Depression and the war, our federal debt stayed pretty steady. It grew a little bit, but not nearly as much as our GDP grew. This allowed this magic number that economists like to key on, the debt to GDP ratio, a ratio between these two lines, to drop dramatically. And if you listen to economists, and again, I'm ripping on economists because I think we have a fantasy narrative that they've created for us that we live in, every time, the lesson of these 2.5 decades have been so powerful for economists and for our culture and for the way we talk about things. You can see every time we run into economic hardship, what do? We say we need to grow our way out of it. Even now, we're going to shut down the federal government here in 4 hours or something like that. If you listen to the two competing economic theories and plans we have coming forth from our two main political parties, what they both have in common is massive deficit spending with the idea that if we just make this commitment, we'll be able to grow our way out of the problems that we have. This is a direct result of this 2.5 decades at the end of World War II, when literally we had the highest debt to GDP ratio, over 120%. Over 120%, and we were able to grow our way out of it. I want to show you what actually happened, because what this shortchanges is what actually happened in the private market. What we saw at the end of World War II is a massive, massive increase in private debt. Yes, we did not spend public debt. We were not juicing the economy with public debt. We allowed ourselves to pay back or to have that ratio go down. But what we did is we replaced the public debt with unprecedented levels of private mortgage debt. We were able to grow our economy on the backs of people taking on more money, more debt to pay more for housing. This is, and I apologize to those of you that don't like charts. I have a few charts in here. I'm an engineer. And I kind of feel like I have to share charts as part of my training. This is the Case-Shiller Home Price Index. The Case-Shiller Home Price Index is a fascinating index, and we could spend the rest of the time I have with you here just looking at this chart. I have set this up to run from the end of World War II to 2008. The chart actually goes back to 1890. What this looks at is how home prices have changed over time relative to incomes. So if you think of times when incomes go up, people are able to pay more for housing, and they do. Times when incomes are flat, people can pay more for housing, they're not. So it's a ratio of the two in a sense. What you see here at the end of World War II is that it took us a little bit of time to get things kind of stable, but then you have this long period of housing price decline. The way you should think about that is the same way you think about the price of computers and flat screen TVs coming down. We had this new innovative technology, then all the supply chains and everything kind of grew around its production, and over time prices came down. That's what's going on right here. Again, this is a period of time that economists like point to as this is how it's done. Okay? Then we had, at the end of the 1960s, a period of inflation. Inflation in the broader economy, inflation in housing prices. I'm going to pause here just for a second and have you think through the inflation story, because it's very important to understand this chart. Banking is generally thought of as a very boring pursuit. I don't know if there's any bankers in the room. I apologize for calling your life boring. I'm sure it's not anymore, but certainly back in the day, there's this idea of the 363 business plan. You borrow money at 3%, you lend out at 6%, and you get out on the golf course by 3 p.m. You will make money off that difference between 3% and 6%. But understand what that 3 and 6% is. 3% is what you're paying your depositors. That's the shortest of short-term loans. Your depositors can come in at any time and get their money back. What you're doing then is you're arbitraging that with a long-term loan. Used to be a 3-year, 4-year, 5-year balloon payment. Now it's a 30-year mortgage. What happens when you have a period of inflation? Interest rates go up. Imagine you're in the 1920s, 19-teens, and you make a loan at 6%, and all of a sudden, interest rates go up to 8%. Well, now you're locked in, and you're losing money every month. But because your portfolio is 3-year, 4-year, 5-year loans, you're going to bleed a little bit, but you'll ultimately refinance all these loans at higher interest rates, and you'll be okay. But that's not what we have in the 1960s. In the 1960s, we have local banks holding long-term mortgages. And so you have decades of losing money when interest rates go up. So you have a choice as a bank. You can either, A, bleed to death, month after month after month of losing money, or B, keep your interest rates that you're paying to depositors low so you can still make a profit, and then all your depositors will leave and your bank will fail immediately. What we saw in the 1960s is that local banks started to fail. Now, during the Great Depression, we had created this organization called Fannie Mae to, in a sense, provide liquidity to local banks to buy those loans from them. In the 1960s, we created two more. We created Freddie Mac and we created Ginnie Mae. And we said, if you are creating these loans and the local bank, you're starting to lose money, it's going bad, the federal government has your back. We will, in a sense, buy those loans from you. We will lose the money. You will get the cash. And then you can make more loans. So in a sense, we had our first bank bailout at the end of the 1960s. And you see, prices moderated again. In the 1970s, we had our second inflationary episode, our second bank bailout of this same type. When we got done with this one, what we saw were organizations like the FDIC and the FDS, I cannot ever remember the acronym, the savings and loan version of this. We had, I'm trying to remember the exact numbers, we had $10 billion in our insurance fund to pay off if banks went insolvent, and we had bank insolvencies of somewhere around $160 billion. There was literally no way for us to, in a sense, fix what had happened to banks during these two episodes. And so what we did is we said, we are going to grow our way out of this. And the way we're going to grow our way out is to deregulate the banking sector and allow them to write what, in a sense, were riskier loans. This brought about the S&L crisis. After this, again, we did a bank bailout. It was very, very expensive. And we started this new project. We called this one decentralization. The idea that we could take and spread risk out. And let me say it the way that they would have said it at the time. We can reduce risk or eliminate risk by spreading risk out over many, many people. This is where you get mortgage-backed securities that had begun in the early 1970s to start to proliferate. A mortgage-backed security, if everybody in this room has a mortgage-backed security is someone will buy those from your local bank, bundle them together, cut them up, and then sell off the pieces as individual securities. We started to, in a sense, need these for our economy. As part of the S&L crisis, one of the things that Congress did to juice housing and juice demand for mortgage-backed securities is to say to local banks, you are required to hold reserves. You can hold those reserves in cash or short-term treasury notes, or now you can also hold them in mortgage-backed securities. And what this did, because cash pays no interest, short-term notes pay very little interest, mortgage-backed securities are 30-year loans, they pay a lot of interest in comparison. What it did is it created an insatiable demand for mortgage-backed securities, which in a sense created an insatiable demand for mortgages. This is where you get no-income loans, you get loans to strippers in Las Vegas who own 5 homes. You get all those stories that you saw in the movie The Big Short, which seemed crazy, but actually was true and happened. And we get the subprime bubble. I want you to look at this chart and recognize one thing. The amplitude of each of these crises grows. And what you are seeing is you are seeing housing move from primarily a product of shelter to primarily a product that is a financial instrument. You are watching the increasing financialization of housing, with housing becoming more responsive now to, in terms of price, to overall financial conditions than to actually supply and demand. What this means today for us is that these are primarily financial products. Secondarily, they are shelter, yes, and we think of them that way. But in our economy, in the way that our country functions, these two things are financial products. If you build single-family homes, there is an infinite amount of liquidity that you can access to build single-family homes. If you are a big builder, there's an unlimited amount of money that you can tap into to build additional homes. The same thing with these 5/1s, these building styles here. There are about, Abby, we interviewed a guy who told us there are about 28 of these builders who build these things predominantly around the country. Those builders can tap into as much capital as they need to build as many of these as they want. The reason these are great financial products is because we have figured out how to standardize these, how to group them together. This is a 3-bedroom, this is a 4-bedroom. We can rate them and rank them out, group them together in different bundles. We use credit scores to kind of do this. In this is a great product because we can set these at different levels. Is it a luxury 5/1? Is it a middle class 5/1? Is it an affordable 5/1? And we can finance those in different ways and bundle them in different ways. These are fantastic financial products. And they sit at the heart, through securitization, at the heart of our financial system. Every bank's reserves in this country are made up of mortgage-backed securities. This changes the dynamic, and I want to make sure that everyone in this room understands this, because when we go and buy a home today, we often think that we are the purchaser buying the product, the home. But the reality is, in our economy today, the transaction that matters is not what is the product, but who is the product. What you are doing when you buy a home with a mortgage is you are creating a piece of paper, a mortgage, that pledges your earnings for the next 30 years to retiring a debt. That is the thing that has value. That is the thing that is bundled with other similar products, is cut up and securitized, is sold off to pension funds and hedge funds and banks, is hypothecated and bet against and hedged against. That's the thing that has value. That's the thing that is driving prices in our economy. So where are we at now? And I need to update this chart because here's where we're at. This is the beginning of 2023, so there's like another, year and a half of data available. The year and a half of data shows this going up and then starting to come down again. We are at all-time highs, even with the recent price declines. And again, I want to show you the economist language. If you go back and listen to any economist post 2008 who talked about this, and even the ones who talk about it today, they will all call the period of time between 2000 and 2008 a housing bubble. And what is a bubble? A bubble is a distortion of reality. It's something that is abnormal, that shouldn't have happened. It's a distortion. Those same exact economists, often in the next sentence, will call what has happened since 2010 a housing recovery. How do you recover to a distortion? How do you regain a bubble condition? What does it mean to get back an unsustainable path? This is where we sit today. And it should give us a lot of tension, because this idea that we can make it easier for more people to borrow more money and pay more for housing has run its course. For a long time, this felt like it was the easy button, the easy answer, the thing we could do. But what we've actually done is we've made it unaffordable for almost everybody to get into a home today. It doesn't matter if you're poor or middle class. It doesn't even matter if you're upper class, really. We see everybody stretched beyond what they think is reasonable to get into housing. I don't want to, I was going to say, you're reminding me that I'm running out of time. Let me say this, and I'm not going to say this in a partisan way, so if you are partisan politically, just repress it for 30 seconds. If you go back to the last election, we had two candidates who both had housing policies as they were. One candidate, the candidate that lost, their housing policy was to make down payment assistance, especially for people who are struggling, more widespread and universal. The other candidate, the candidate that won, their vision and plan was, let's privatize Fannie and Freddie. Fannie and Freddie were taken into conservatorship during the 2007, 2008 crisis. Let's re-privatize them so that they can write, I can't remember how they're phrasing it. I'm going to say riskier loans. Loans that, I think they said innovative loan packages, right? Basically 40-year and 50-year mortgages. Down payment assistance and 50-year mortgages accomplish the same thing. They allow people to pay more for housing by allowing them to borrow more and literally pay more for housing. They do not reduce housing prices. They do not make housing more affordable. That is the trap we have gotten ourselves into. And that is the way you get people into housing when you're trapped. Prices can't go down, so how do we make it easier for people to pay more? Instead of having them pledge 30 years of their earnings, how about they pledge 40 years or 50 years of their earnings? We may be months away from that product being rolled out in a large scale. If we recognize that these are financial products, what it does is it opens up the door for us locally to have a different discussion about housing. This is a chart. Don't read too deeply into this. It's just a standard bell curve. I want to tell a story about where capital is in our markets today. If we look at capital distribution, what we see is that most of the money that goes into housing goes into these two financial products. You can get an unlimited amount of money to build single-family homes. You can get an unlimited amount of money to build 5over1s. That's where the money goes. If we go to the very wealthy end of the spectrum, wealthy people do not have a problem obtaining financing for their houses. They just don't. Where there is huge demand and there is no money at all is this end of the spectrum, the entry-level end. The side of the spectrum where we have lots and lots and lots of demand, but we actually have no financial products, we have no capital to meet that demand. And so nothing is being built over here. We can actually solve that problem locally. That's what I want to talk to you about tonight. What do these products look like at that entry-level end? A lot of them look like this. This is a single-family home. 2 out of 3 households in the country are single and 2-person households. But 2 out of 3 homes in this country are single-family homes with multiple bedrooms. What this means is that there are many, many people who are living in homes with bedrooms that they just don't use. Some of these people are elderly. They are on fixed incomes. They are, in a sense, house rich, cash poor. In prior days, prior eras, it was very natural what would happen, right? What would happen is that you would take one of those spare bedrooms, you would go to whatever the Home Depot equivalent of the day was, you would put in a kitchenette, you would put an exterior door on, and you would rent that thing out as a little apartment. You could do that in a weekend. It'd be very, very simple to do. In most jurisdictions in North America, you can't do that today. It's a duplex. That changes the whole nature and character of the neighborhood. Not allowed. Yet if we allowed someone to do this, not only would they be able to stay in their house, have more resources, but again, I'm going to use this word moral again. The idea of having someone around that can shovel the snow on your sidewalk, mow your yard, maybe take you to the grocery store now and then, maybe if you have an accident and you need medical assistance, be there to call someone. These are all things that I think in prior generations of Americans never had to think about and worry about. These were things that would just naturally occurred that we have made illegal extremely difficult to do. This is a backyard cottage. Don't call these ADUs. ADU sounds like a disease that you catch. I think planners do such a bad job of branding. No one wants an ADU in their neighborhood, but if you say, I want a backyard cottage so my mother-in-law doesn't have to go into a home, so she can come here and live with us and we can look after her and she can help out with the kids and we can live, that kind of a lifestyle. Most people look at that and say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. This is something that we call a house. Some people like to call these tiny houses. I think the important distinction here, again, don't call it a tiny house. What this actually is a starter house, right? It's a 300, 400, 500 square foot place. The kind of things that our ancestors, and I say that in the broadest sense of the word, would have recognized as the place where you get started. You build something small with the modest means that you have. When you save up a little bit of money, you put an addition on the back. When you have a kid, you put on a second story. The neighbor comes over and helps. You go over and help your neighbor. We nostalgize this as the way we build traditional cities, yet we don't allow this today in most neighborhoods. We don't allow someone to start small. These are all things that we can do again. We can do at scale, and what we find is that there's tremendous demand for doing so. There are three things that we need to do to achieve this vision of filling this empty space in our housing demand, the place where we have tremendous demand, but nobody building the units. And if anyone tells you that we can only do one of these three things, they're either out of touch or they're trying to sell you something. We actually have three rather difficult things to do, but all things that are attainable by us. The first one is we need to reform our codes. We need to reform our regulations. We need to make it legal to build these entry-level units. The second thing we need is we need people to actually build them. We need to nurture an ecosystem of local incremental developers that will actually go out and build this stuff. And then the third thing we need to do is we need to finance these units locally. We actually need to create a local market to finance, to provide capital to those places that cannot get capital today. And just as a preview, so you all don't think I'm nuts, most times when you hear people talk about the government involved in financing housing, what they are saying today in our current market is that we need governments to lose money so that housing can remain at the same price that it's always been. We are not saying that. When we say localized finance, what we are talking about is local governments have capacity to actually make strategic investments in a place where the market is left a gap, where the market is not meeting the needs today. And we can do that without risking money and without losing money. And I'll give you a little bit of preview of what that looks like here in a second. But let's talk about this first one, code reform. We put out, let me say this. When I wrote this book, and Daniel Harrigus co-wrote with me, we got to the end and we're like, yeah, we're very proud of this. It will tell people what to do and we can get out and start building this housing. And then I went out on book tour. And every place I went, I would run into people, including really good, cool mayors, who would say, I read the book, I listened to your presentation, I'm all in, where do I start? And it was so deflating to me, because I'm like, the book tells you where to start. But I realized that people needed like a bite size where to start. And so what we have done is we've dedicated ourselves to creating 3 toolkits, one for each of these steps. The first one is called the Housing Ready City. This is the website. I'll show this website at the end so you can get it then. You don't have to copy it down now. But this toolkit has 6 regulatory reforms that every city needs to make that will help your city be housing ready. We actually created a map where people can go in and take a little quiz and get their city on the map to show how housing ready they are. Let's go through these 6 things real quick. First, we need to allow single-family homes to be converted into duplexes or triplexes, and that needs to be by right. And when I say by right, what I mean is no real regulatory friction. Don't have to go genuflect in front of the planning board, go through months of regulatory process. You're in City Hall, you get your permit, you leave. We need to allow backyard cottages in all zones, again, by right. This should not be a controversial or difficult thing. We need to legalize starter homes in all residential zones. And I want to say one little thing about the starter home. A lot of people think that what we're talking about is the thing we've started to see pop up, which is like a cluster of tiny homes. I hate the idea of a cluster of tiny homes. What I'm talking about is that you actually have 2 houses with space in between them. That should have a tiny home in it. That's what our ancestors would have done in this city, in my city, in all cities. They would have looked and said, where can we fit another house in here somewhere? One of the ways you facilitate that and make that easy to have happen, in other words, affordable housing distributed throughout all your existing neighborhoods, is to get rid of your minimum lot size requirements in those existing neighborhoods. I understand that we're going to have lot size requirements when we're building a new subdivision, but when you have the sewer, the water, the roadway in place, houses built a century old or more, you're not going to move them around. What you're going to do is you're going to readjust the lot lines so that we can start fitting more homes in these neighborhoods. Yes, they all need to have access. I get it. But if you unleash developers outside of kind of the dumb suburban cookie cutter codes that we have, and allow them flexibility, they will be able to get a lot more units in neighborhoods in ways that keep the character of that neighborhood. We need to repeal parking mandates for housing. I know this is something that, yeah, you're cheering parking, not me. Although I've said this, I think, every time I've been here. This is a Strong Towns, one of our 5 core campaigns. And then the sixth thing is we need streamlined approval process. And I was going to say, if you read the housing toolkit, I actually say the standard for these entry-level units, not for everything that you build and everything in your code, but for these entry-level units, 24-hour permit approval. I've had cities like call me up and be like, you are out of your mind. What they don't recognize is that I did permit approvals for a decade. I actually ran a company where we did permit approvals, and 24-hour permit approval on things like this are very, very possible. We need to actually shoot for that. People are building simple things. They need to have simple permits, and they need to be able to move forward with them quickly. This is a lot about framing and how we talk about this. We often try to, and I think if you listen to some housing advocates today, they try to make this very political, very partisan. They want to have big fights. They want to have big platforms. They want to yell at people. I think that this should be the most boring revolution that ever happens. What we want to do is we want to talk about these things in terms that are very blasé and boring. If you add a backyard cottage to a neighborhood, I'm telling you, you will drive by and you will not even know that it's there. If you convert a single family home into a duplex, you're literally going to drive by and you're not going to know that it happened. These are the kind of things that we want to see going on everywhere without anyone being aware of it. This is the most boring revolution we could lead. All right, so I said the second toolkit, we actually came out with it this Monday. So yesterday, we released toolkit number 2. So I'm here, you're the first group that I'm going to present this to, but you can go to the same website and get this. This is about how we build this set of incremental developers. How do we get people who will actually go out and build this stuff? Because right now, if they tell you, I want backyard cottages, they'll say, no one's out building them. I can't get them. They're hundreds of thousands of dollars. That can't be. We need people to actually do this. So here's the important insight. The builders you need already live in your city. They're just sitting on the sidelines today. They're not actually out there doing the stuff that we want them to do. They have an issue that's holding them back. And when we ask them, what's holding you back, what we get, and we interviewed dozens and dozens of these people doing this all over the country, what they say is they didn't hit a wall, they hit a tangle. They hit a bunch of regulations and a bunch of like half yeses, half nos. They got worn down and they gave up. Understand what an incremental developer is. This is someone who has a passion for something in their neighborhood that they want to go do. And they might have some skills, but being a developer is really hard. You've got to know building regulations. You've got to know how to write contracts. You've got to know how to do a pro forma. You've got to know how to look at a plumber's work and see if it's good or not. You've got to know you've got to be like a Renaissance person. You've got to know all these things. Generally, when people come to the table as incremental developers, they'll have one or two of those skills, but they'll be missing some. What we can do is help them fill in the gaps, not let them get worn down, not let them held back. So the role of the city is to build the support structure to allow these people to stand up and co-create in our communities. What we are suggesting is a culture shift inside of City Hall. And again, I didn't say any of this was easy. I actually think it is easy if we commit to it, but committing to it is the hard part. I want to give you the 5 culture shifts. The first one is we need to provide people clarity on where to start. Often this is just as easy as giving them like a script. Go here, go here, go here. That's how you get your permit. Just being like really clear about how you navigate the process. The second part is to make the process proportional to the project. We're building a tiny house, right? We're building a small starter house. We're converting a single-family home into a duplex by renting out one of the bedrooms. We're going to put in a backyard cottage. These are easy things. You should not have the same approval process that you do for building a new Costco in the middle of a neighborhood or building a new subdivision with 200 homes. The process should be really easy and proportional to what you're asking to have happen. The third thing, we need to bring people together and link them together. In the book, we profile cities like South Bend, Indiana, which would just have like once a month pizza parties for developers. And it sounds silly, but they would bring them in a room and they would have city staff there to answer their questions, but then they just got talking to each other and magic happened. Because if you're an incremental developer, you're like, I hired this plumber. He just did me wrong. And the other guy's like, yeah, I know a better plumber than that. Here's his card. Here's his contact information. You start filling in gaps and start helping each other. These people aren't competitors as much as they are trying to build and create a market for themselves. Getting them together creates a lot of magic. We need City Hall to shift from a mindset of gatekeeping to guidance. We've actually seen cities where they name someone as a Sherpa, and if you come in on Tuesdays with your incremental development application, they will actually just take you and walk you from department to department and get your stuff done. Like their job is to get your permit approved. Like let's figure out how to make this happen. It's a shift in mindset, but it's a really important one. And then the final one is to make financing easier to access. The third toolkit is going to be about this financing issue. And I have 2 minutes and 45 seconds to go through the last couple things here. This is where people have the most questions, and so there's a lot of eager anticipation. This toolkit should be out the early part of next year. Let me give you a couple things as examples of what we're talking about, because again, what we can't have is we can't have cities losing money. When cities have to be the dumb money in the game, when cities have to lose money, there's a finite amount of housing that can be built. What we have is an overwhelming demand for entry-level units. And so we can't do this in a way where cities continually lose money. This is a program in Oswego, New York. And the brilliant thing about this is that they did micro grants in neighborhoods for exterior improvements. These are in neighborhoods that were struggling with a lot of disinvestment. And instead of coming in with a big development and dislocating people, what they did is they went out and said, if you make an improvement that's visible from the street, we will reimburse you 50% of that. Up to, and it was really a nominal dollar amount, like $200. Here was the catch. You couldn't apply as an individual. You could only apply as a block. And you had to have at least 70% of your block apply at the same time. So this did two things that were really important to turning the neighborhood around. The first thing it did is it got everybody in the neighborhood talking to each other about their vision for how they could make their property better. So people who were giving up on their neighborhood because it had been in decline, all of a sudden were having a conversation with their neighbors about how they wanted to paint their house and fix up their yard and replace the windows and do things visible from the street. The second thing it did is that all of a sudden, instead of one house here and one house there becoming better, all of a sudden an entire block got better all at once. And people who lived in this neighborhood couldn't ignore that. It's like, my gosh, have you been to that block over there? Look at how that transformed overnight. And it became contagious. They have invested nominal sums of money in a struggling neighborhood and seen millions of dollars of property value appreciation, homes reclaimed, homes rebuilt, homes renewed. And here's the coolest part, no gentrification, nobody kicking out, nobody leaving the neighborhood. All that wealth accruing to the people who are there. In Muskegon, Michigan, they have older neighborhoods where they have gaps in the streetscape. House, gap, house, gap. They've been gaps for decades. What they did is they said, we will use tax increment financing, which is generally like the dumbest development tool. I have actually written all about some of the things you have done here in Kansas City that bring us all great shame when it comes to tax increment financing. This is one of the more brilliant ones I've ever seen. They said, we will make your down payment for you if you build a less than 900 square foot house on one of these lots. So a starter house on one of these lots. Here's how it works. When you have a bare lot, you pay this much in tax. When you build a house, you pay this much in tax. That difference is called the increment. What the city would do is the city would borrow the money, make your down payment for you, and then pay themselves back with the increment. When that's done, then the city collects a tax and the school district collects a tax again. If you flip the house or leave early, you have to pay it back. There's clawback provisions. But the reality is that they got a lot of houses built very quickly without the city having to raise taxes or inject money or even lose money at the end of the day. In Minnesota, we're able to do the same thing with special assessments. So you're used to a special assessment on your road. We can actually do that with these kind of incremental housing units. The cool thing about TIF and about the special assessments is that the city becomes the primary mortgage holder. So in other words, if you have a first mortgage and a second mortgage and you default, the first mortgage gets made whole first, and then the second mortgage gets whatever is left over. In these scenarios, the city gets made whole first, and then the primary mortgage holder, and then the secondary mortgage holder. So in a sense, we are able to provide this financing at very low cost, at very low interest, and we take really no real risk as a city for doing it. And in Florida, we've seen where philanthropic organizations, but also a couple of cities, have stepped in and said, we know local banks, these products are hard to finance for you. Local banks like to finance things that they can sell off on a secondary market if they need the cash. You're going to do this product here, and we know you can't do that, so it's riskier for you. How can we hedge that risk? And what we've seen is that philanthropic organizations in the cities have actually gone into local banks and co-signed loans. Not put up any capital, not promised anything, except that if the loan defaults, they will repay. They have some guidelines for how they'll do this and the situations they'll do this, but we have not seen any city or any philanthropy lose money doing this process in the right neighborhoods. Let me end with this. We talk a lot about housing, and we talk a lot about the housing market and how, yes, housing's unaffordable, but when you get to the human part of it, we talk a lot about how we would like to have our kids grow up in the community that we live. We'd like to have our parents be able to move here and live here. We'd like to maybe sometime be able to move houses or move around the neighborhood. And what we've seen is that as we have further financialized housing, all of those dreams have become impaired to one degree or another. I have two daughters. They're both in college now. I have serious doubts about their future because I don't know where they can actually move and get a job and be able to afford a house. A lot of us are in this situation, whether it's our parents, whether it's our kids, whether it's someone we know or care about. I'm not suggesting that we can change Fannie Freddie. I'm not suggesting we can change the Federal Reserve. I'm not suggesting that we're going to change the banking or the financial system. I'm not suggesting that. And if you have plans to do that some other way, go do it. But what I'm telling you is that here in your community, we can actually change the market for entry-level housing. And if we do that, I want you to understand what that does. Not only does that create a huge, tremendous market for people to get a start. And really, what is the American dream about but being able to get a start and work your way up? But here's the other thing it does. When those people who are in those entry-level homes, that starter home, that backyard cottage, whatever it is, when they want to enter the market now and get a 30-year mortgage and move into their dream house and start that family and do whatever it is on the progression of life, they are going to do it from a position of strength and security. They're not going to be desperate to get into a house. They're not going to be sitting there, oh, my rent is coming up and I got to renew my lease or should I go find a house? They're not going to be forced to move. They're going to be in a secure situation, one where they'll likely be able to save up some money and make a down payment. They're going to enter the market in a position of strength, not desperation. And when they enter the market in a position of strength, not desperation, do you know what that is going to do to all of our market here locally? It will moderate it. It will moderate it. It will make it so that our housing prices become more localized and less connected to the insane national market that we've created. That's what a sane system looks like. That's a system we can have here, but we have to dedicate ourselves to wanting to see it done. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. Strongtowns.org is our website. Please, everything we do on there is free and available for everybody. If you want the toolkits, there's 2 of them available now. The third one will be out early next year. That's at strongtowns.org/housing ready. And I think we're going to do questions.
Got about 10 minutes for questions. I would ask that you please use the microphones down here at the end so the folks watching at home can hear the question as well as the answer.
My situation that I'm thinking about is all of these major corporation hedge funds, et cetera, coming in and buying up all the starter housing and then charging exorbitant rents What are your thoughts about that?
I mean, I think that my first reaction is like, that is actually the system we've set up. I actually think it's worse than that. We're actually doing a profile right now, an investigative series that is not running yet, but hopefully will run in a couple weeks, looking at a Silicon Valley-backed app designed to go into poor, struggling neighborhoods, buy homes that incremental developers would normally buy or people would normally buy and fix up, essentially outbidding them with cash. By doing so, circumventing the mortgage market and all the kind of health and safety checks that are built into that system, and then renting those out as slumlord properties. They're actually active here in Kansas City as well as other kind of more Midwestern markets. I think this is horrible, but I think it is an inevitable outcome of the system we've created, which really is about solving the problems of our society by labeling them growth problems, and then solving growth by injecting liquidity into the system. When we inject money, liquidity in the system, it flows to people with capital, and then they are able to do things like that. I don't like that financial system. Not my thing. Please.
Yeah, so I guess my question has to do with, a lot of cities around the world use a lot of public or socialized housing to help with their housing markets and
Yeah.
to stabilize that.
Yeah.
I guess, how are ways, it wasn't really mentioned very much in here, but a lot of cities in places around the world are really successful with that. So how can places like Kansas City use that to help their housing market?
Here's what I'll say. I don't pick fights with people who say the government needs to build housing and we need to have the government in the market and da-da-da-da, because I understand that there's a huge gap and I understand that this is a good faith effort. What I will say is that I've never seen an approach that scales to the size of the problem we need. I'm not a fan of the government losing money. So, it's one thing to think about the federal government as being able to print money and do whatever. As a city actually functions like a family. Families can't spend more than they have. Cities actually also cannot spend more than they have. I hate to break it to you, but your city is financially insolvent. You have more promises that you've made to yourself than you actually have capacity to do it. And that math is like relentless and can't be changed. So to me, the constraint that I operate in is that the city doesn't have money. How can they do things at scale without, in a sense, losing money? And I don't see the public housing people approaching it in that way, and so I tend to not really engage with it all that much. Please.
I promise there's a question at the end of this.
Okay.
I spent a lot of years on the Planning Commission in the third largest city in Oklahoma. And a couple of things I learned was
Trying to think of what the third largest one is.
Norman, Oklahoma.
Norman?
Norman.
Okay. I know Norman fairly well, so yeah, keep going.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, I know Norman
If you
really,
promise.
really well. Yeah.
Mixed use housing was a really dirty word.
Yeah, it was.
And the biggest pushback we got was from the people in a neighborhood when there was a variance come up. One of the things that this caused me to learn was if the city's planning commission and principal planner, what's the position of principal planners to your plan? I like it from my perspective. Are they on board?
Yeah. Okay, so Norman is a deeply dysfunctional place. And one of the things that everybody in the crowd should know about Norman is that Oklahoma cities operate primarily on the sales tax. So anytime you add more people to your city, you're adding more expense without more revenue. So homes themselves are like not helpful. It's a really messed up system. I think it's important for all of us, city planners and others included, to understand what I think is derogatively called the NIMBYs and their pushback to multifamily, to density, to all these things. It is not hard to look around and recognize that when you have a system that delivers those two products, and you're choosing between those two products, if you have a neighborhood of single-family homes or like modest homes, and then you're going to build multifamily, what that means is you're switching to the other product. And so you're going to build something that is out of scale, that doesn't fit in your neighborhood. And whether or not that's the proposal in front of you, it is not wrong for people to understand that that is typically how it's done. I think it's important for us when we talk about the strong towns approach of building entry-level units and having an ecosystem of developers that are going to do that, and a city that's going to fill in the capital that's missing, is that we tell them in human stories. I showed you an elderly woman, a beautiful elderly woman, and I told you a story about how she had someone living in her house who could help shovel the sidewalks and bring her to the grocery store. Guess what? There's hundreds of people in that exact situation in your community. Make them the story you tell. There are tons of people in your community that have a mother or a father who they're looking at putting in a nursing home because they can't stay by themselves anymore, but they want their independence and their autonomy. And it would be great if they could have a backyard cottage to live in and have the dignity of being able to have their own space while also, being part of the family. That's a story that we can tell. That's a story we can talk about. That is not ADUs and multifamily and all the stupid jargon that planners use. If you're talking to your planner, coach them on this. Let's talk about this in human ways, because shelter is about humans. And I think when we professionalize it, what happens is you get the post-World War II cookie cutter kind of atomization that you see coming out of most city halls today, not just yours. Please. I'm trying to go fast and keep up with everybody.
Great presentation, Chuck.
Thank you.
So much for coming. Yeah, really excited about this. I'm an architect that specializes in housing here in town, also a land bank commissioner. We're working very hard on these issues that you're talking about. So the good news is Kansas City does allow, Kansas City, Missouri, ADUs. Mm-hmm. And we have, yes, thank you for everybody who worked on that policy. Can't take credit for it, but yes. And also there's a prototype housing program that we're currently working on, 8 houses starting from 400 square feet, including an ADU unit, a 2-car garage with a unit on top, that are going to be permit ready with the latest energy code within the coming months. So I'd love for everybody here to come to the land bank and buy a small lot and build one of these starter homes on it. Invite anybody who's interested to talk to us about it. So that's the good news. The challenge is that the cost of building those houses usually exceeds their value.
Yeah.
How do you address that?
Okay. I had an economist once who I was speaking at a school of real estate finance people, and there were a bunch of economists in the room. I had one come up to me and say, "You're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong." And she actually said, the way we make housing cheaper is to put more money into housing, and that will allow this like efficiencies of scale to grow up, and we can deliver housing. Remember I showed you at the end of World War II how housing prices went down for a while, the flat screen TV thing? We see housing prices going the other way now in a big way. And I want to point out to you one thing that will take this and multiply it over the 1,000 parts that go into your home. Today in the United States, we have 2 companies that make lumber. We have all kinds of mills and all kinds of loggers and all kinds of people in the chain, but basically like 2 companies that sell to Home Depot and Costco and your local lumber yard. 2. And you know what happened 2 weeks ago? There was a story in the Wall Street Journal. Building is declining. We're building fewer homes now because prices have moderated and started to come down. That's the other side of this kind of top-down equation. We can liberalize zoning, but when prices start to go down, builders pull back. So we build fewer homes till prices stabilize and start going up again. That's what a nationalized, financialized market looks like. because housing prices have stabilized and builders have pulled back, the lumber mills have pulled back. There's not a plethora of competition out there. This is like an OPEC for lumber. And what does OPEC do when oil prices fall? They cut production to get oil prices up, right? This is exactly what's going on now in lumber. Prices are going down, so we cut production, so prices go back up. In other words, if we keep the system we have, there is no way to make housing affordable, period. What we are talking about is relocalizing a system so that you get local supply and demand. You get a local ecosystem of developers. And I'm not going to pretend that will solve every problem in the supply chain, but I will tell you this, you are capable of producing your own lumber locally. If you have all national builders and big builders and Wall Street funded builders and programs to allow people to pay more for housing, you're never going to develop that system. But if you have local incremental developers who are doing that work, they will find ways to make things cheaper. They will find ways to source things differently. That's what it looks like. So I don't have a magic bullet solution to that, but I do have a sense that the problem we're stuck in is not solvable with the tools we're using today. Please, you have something?
Yeah. I think you're taking the easy way out. Why don't you talk about immigrants? They come here, they're exploding the population of this country, but they're not bringing houses with them. And the other thing is people, poor people having kids that they can't afford, and the government does absolutely nothing about that.
Let him finish. The speaker will address the question. Thank you.
And the other thing, your idea about building houses in lots like that, you're stuffing the neighborhood. It doesn't sound like a very good idea to stuff people in neighborhoods just because there's some land that they can build a small house in.
Good? Okay. So let me harken back to the first presentation that I gave here. And if you want, you can go on strongtowns.org and just type Kansas City, and you'll get a whole bunch of analysis that we've done with Urban 3 about your city in specific. After World War II, you had, in a sense, neighborhoods that were traditional, were well-developed, were middle class, had lots of people in it, lots of stuff going on. Planners today would call them walkable mixed use. People of the past would have called them neighborhoods. You essentially ripped that out and spent tons of government money, your money, state money, federal money, building this massive city spread out all over the landscape. As Dennis showed you, you've not increased your population, but you've increased your liabilities by 5 times. All of you have 5 times more road to maintain, 5 times more pipe to maintain. Essentially, you're spending your wealth maintaining all of this stuff. And by the way, when we run the numbers, you're spending about 10 to 20 cents on the dollar of what you need to actually accomplish that. I'm kind of with the idea that we don't stuff people into cities. But if you step back and you look, there's tremendous demand to live in walkable urban neighborhoods. There's in a sense, the most expensive housing you have in your community are in some of those neighborhoods. And we can go around the country and see the same thing over and over again. People pay a premium to live somewhere where they can have one car, where they can walk to things, where they can have neighborhoods and their church up the street and all that. People pay a premium to live in that. And so what I'm suggesting is not that we stuff people in, but I'm suggesting that we allow the gaps to be filled in that actually were filled in a prior generation, by a prior civilization, by people who lived here before, by your ancestors. All I'm suggesting is that we actually have the development pattern that ancient humans developed and gave us as their wisdom, that we are allowed to build that again. Thank you. Whether it's immigrants occupying it or non-immigrants, what we see is that when you have neighborhoods that are dynamic, neighborhoods where you can build, neighborhoods where people are allowed to respond to stress and opportunity that's presented to them, what you see is that dynamically cities can grow and become very prosperous. When we lock them down with rules and regulations, when we shut them off and say, nope, no more, what happens is that cities stagnate, they become fragile, and you get the insolvency that you have today. We need neighborhoods to be dynamic places. Please.
My question centers around permitting. You touched on it a little bit. I like
Yeah.
the idea of Kansas City Sherpas. Right now in Kansas City Mo, we're running about a 90-day plus period on commercial permits.
Okay.
Are there specific ways that we can show the city how to speed up permitting?
That's awesome. 9+ days is actually better than most places. I'll say that. Here's the most innovative thing I've ever seen in solving this. And by the way, you actually have to have staff and or elected officials that want to solve this problem. So the answer is like you have to have that buy-in. But if you do, what we have seen is that cities will actually apply. They'll say, all right, do we want this backyard cottage? Yes, we want backyard cottages. Okay, we're going to apply for our own permit, our backyard cottage. We're not going to build it, we're just going to apply. And we want to see the process that it goes through. Where does it get stuck? We'll apply here, and then, it sits on this desk for 10 days. All right, why? Do we have to have this part of the process? Can we speed this up somehow? Can we get this pre-approved somehow? By following your own, in a sense, you're releasing something and then following it through your own pipes, you can clear the blockages out, and at the end of the day, speed up that process. And that's actually the way that I've seen cities do it that's the most effective. They have to want to do it, they have to want to clear those blockages. But oftentimes what it is elected officials are like, yeah, I want 24-hour permit approval, but I don't know how to do it. Or the staff saying, I want 24-hour permit, but don't know how to do it. Release into the wild and follow it and see where it gets hung up. Does that make sense?
Yes, and it sounds like part of it's like a staffing.
It's not a staffing issue. No. What it is that you, almost every time, what you do is you have unnecessary steps, or you have a process that's out of proportion to what you're asking for. One of the most common ones we see, we saw this in Florida in a place that we were kind of counseling to walk through this process. They required the fire chief to sign off on every new building permit. It would just sit on the fire chief's desk for 45 days. That dude has like so much going on to sit down and go through all these permits. So they would just sit there, and for no good reason. And the reality is that for a backyard cottage, they didn't have the fire chief. The fire chief says, as long as it's 10 feet away from the house, I don't care. Like, it was not a big deal. So we just said, all right, as long as it's 10 feet from the house, it doesn't have to go to the fire chief. Took out 45 days off the permitting process. So I feel like it's that the process is unnecessary or out of proportion is mostly what we see.
If you have
I've been challenged to help cities with 24-hour permits, so I'm going to be writing something up specifically on that.
Chuck, we're down to our last few minutes. I want to make sure we get to these two people that have been waiting in line. And then if there's additional questions, do you mind if people see you in the signing line afterwards?
Not at all, please.
My husband and I just put an offer in on a house which was denied, so the hunt continues, but it was in a neighborhood with a neighborhood association that won't allow so much as a shed to be built in the backyard. And so I'm curious how your ideas about zoning reform to allow certain things by right interacts with homeowners associations.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's funny because affluent neighborhoods with homeowners associations don't like change. But those neighborhoods are often not bought by people who want to make those changes. So it generally doesn't become an issue. Poor neighborhoods, or neighborhoods that, because understand the life cycle of a suburban neighborhood. We build things to a finished state, get 20, 25 years of it looking good, then everybody's roof fails at the same time, everybody's siding fails at the same time, the neighborhood goes into decline, and poorer people buy in, okay? The poorer you go on the spectrum, the less people either care about or have the resources to enforce homeowners association rules that are dumb. There's some exceptions to this. California is a huge exception to this. And one of the things we've seen in California is a nullification of homeowners association rules that violate like state law and other things. So there are ways to like remedy around this, but the way it's mostly remedied is that through apathy, nobody enforces it. Because what a homeowners association is an agreement that, like, if we're an association and you break the rules of the association, we will all join together to hire an attorney to take you to civil court and force you to do something because it's a private contract. If we all don't care enough to do that, it's not going to happen. And that's generally where this ends up. But if you buy into a more affluent neighborhood where one or two people get a bee up their bonnet, they will enforce it, you know. So there's a nuance there. Last one?
If so.
Okay, go for it.
Just in your last step, when you were talking about the local governments co-signing on loans,
Yeah.
you said right neighborhoods. What makes, like, what's the definition of a right neighborhood, and what's the difference between this co-signing in those neighborhoods versus like the New Deal redlining? Because I think that those would be similar arguments in that this is a profitable neighborhood.
Yeah, I feel like it's a really good question. Let me go back to the Homeowners Loan Corporation I talked about in the 1930s, because I glossed over this with the redlining, and I think it's really important, because we've done some really interesting, I think, important work here looking at your redlining situation, and Troost is this like dividing line that is kind of more stark than most other cities have. If you're the federal government in the 1930s, your FDR, you're embarking on a radical shift in how we're going to finance housing. I explained that housing was financed at local banks, and now the federal government's going to come in, and the federal government's going to back it. Understand the conversation at that time. The conversation at that time is, how can the federal government do something so risky with taxpayer dollars? How can they do something so reckless with taxpayer dollars? They're putting all of our money at risk backing these loans. What the Homeowners Loan Corporation did is they said, we will approve it, but we'll only approve it for loans that are not risky. You locals figure out what your good neighborhoods are, your neighborhoods that are not going to be risky, and your neighborhoods that are risky. I think that if we are generous, we can understand where that impulse comes from, or like why that was done. But then when we look at what happened on the ground, they went and say, well, your neighborhood is really nice. It's kind of upper class. Your neighborhood's a little like risque. We're going to mark you yellow or red. We'll mark you green or blue. Money for you, not for you. You do that over generations, and it doesn't work. When I say good neighborhood in today's context, what I'm really talking about is a neighborhood with demand. And I think this is an important nuance, and we could go hours on this. Let me say something that to some of you who have read Strung Downs will be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And to others of you that haven't, you'll say, that's the most insane thing I've ever heard. We are going to, in the next generation, walk away from much of what we've built that we would call suburb today. We have overbuilt, we have overconstructed. There's not enough there to actually pay to maintain it. If you look at the layout of your city, you can't have a sewer pipe out here unless you have a sewer pipe here, because it literally runs through here to get to where your treatment plant is. And so if you have to maintain one or the other, you maintain the one here, and the one here goes away. If you're dumb enough to maintain the one out here and not the one here, and you only have money for one of them, your sewage is going to run to nothing, and then you both fail. You will not do that. And so what we have set up is a system that grew really quick, and I think is going to collapse relatively quick. If you want a preview of what this looks like, go to Detroit. And so, to me, the idea of a good neighborhood, I would not co-sign loans out in this like hinterland. They're not likely to want backyard cottages anyway, but like I also said today to a group, I wouldn't be building sidewalks out there. I wouldn't be building mixed-use neighborhoods out there. If I have a sidewalk budget to do 2 miles of sidewalk in a year, I'm looking at where are people walking, and I'm putting my sidewalks there. I'm not looking at where do people want to walk their dog someday. I'm looking at where do people walking to work today. That's where I'm putting my sidewalk. So to me, a good neighborhood in the context that I kind of flippantly use that word, I probably would use a different word, but let's still go with it, would be a neighborhood that has the capacity to evolve and to change over time. Neighborhoods that are frozen in place are fragile, I think will atrophy, and I think have a strong likelihood of going away, in which case your local cosign becomes a really bad deal for taxpayers. If we cosign in a neighborhood that has the ability to evolve and adapt and change, I think that cosigning has very low risk, and I think that's one where we can fill a demand and meet a need without leveraging the taxpayer or what you don't want to do is you don't want to impair your tax base because you want your tax base to be able to do other supportive things. Does that make sense? Okay. Thank you, everybody.